Alexander Hartwell stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, watching the city lights twinkle 50 floors below. At 52, he owned one of the most successful tech companies in the world. His empire stretched across continents, employing over 40,000 people. Yet as he looked down at the bustling streets, he felt more alone than ever. The silence in his office was deafening. It was past midnight, and the building was empty except for the night security guards. This had become his routine, staying late not because he had to, but because going home to his empty penthouse felt even lonelier than sitting in his office chair. His assistant had left a stack of congratulatory letters on his desk. Tomorrow marked exactly 30 years since he'd started his company in a cramped garage with nothing but a laptop and a dream. The media called him a visionary. Business magazines featured him on their covers. Forbes ranked him among the richest people alive. But none of that mattered when he ate dinner alone every night. Alexander walked back to his mahogany desk and picked up one of the letters. It was from the mayor, praising his contributions to the city's economy. Another came from a university, thanking him for his scholarship program. These letters used to fill him with pride. Now they felt like hollow reminders of what he'd traded for success. He remembered the early days vividly. Working 18-hour shifts, surviving on coffee and determination. Back then, he'd told himself the sacrifices were temporary. Once the company took off, he'd have time for relationships, for a family, for the simple pleasures he'd put on hold. But success had been addictive. Each milestone led to another goal. Each achievement demanded even more of his time and energy. His phone buzzed with a text from his publicist. "Don't forget about tomorrow's anniversary celebration. The press will be there at 3 p.m. sharp." Alexander stared at the message and felt nothing. 30 years of building an empire, and he'd be celebrating with employees who saw him as a boss, not a friend, and reporters who wanted quotes for their stories. The irony wasn't lost on him. His company had revolutionized communication technology, connecting millions of people around the world. Yet he himself had never felt more disconnected from humanity. He had the power to video call anyone on the planet, but nobody he actually wanted to call. Alexander's mind drifted to his college roommate David, who'd chosen a different path. David had become a high school teacher, married his college sweetheart, and raised 3 kids. They'd lost touch years ago when Alexander's schedule became too demanding for maintaining friendships. He wondered if David ever thought about their late-night conversations about changing the world. Back then, changing the world meant making people's lives better, not just making money. The cleaning crew arrived, their quiet chatter echoing through the hallways. Alexander watched them work through his glass door. They seemed happy, joking with each other as they emptied trash bins and wiped down desks. When was the last time he'd laughed like that? When was the last time work had felt joyful instead of just necessary? His stomach growled, reminding him he'd skipped dinner again. The executive cafeteria had closed hours ago, and his usual 5-star restaurant would require calling ahead, dealing with staff who knew exactly who he was and treated him with the careful politeness reserved for very important people. The thought exhausted him. Alexander made an impulsive decision. He loosened his tie, grabbed his coat, and headed for the elevator. He needed to get away from the celebration plans, the congratulatory messages, and the weight of his own success. He needed to breathe. The city looked different from street level. During his usual commute in the back of his town car, Alexander rarely noticed the details. Now walking without a destination, he saw things he'd forgotten existed. Street vendors selling hot dogs to late-night workers. A group of friends sharing pizza on a bench. An elderly couple walking hand in hand, moving slowly but looking content. These people had something he'd lost somewhere along the way. They had connections, simple pleasures, moments of genuine happiness that didn't depend on stock prices or quarterly reports. Alexander envied them more than they could ever know. His feet carried him to a neighborhood he'd never visited before. The buildings were older here, with character that his sterile office tower lacked. Neon signs advertised family-owned shops and local restaurants. It felt authentic in a way his usual world of corporate headquarters and exclusive clubs never did. Then he saw it, a small diner tucked between a laundromat and a bookstore. The sign read Rosie's Place in faded letters, and warm yellow light spilled from its windows onto the sidewalk. Through the glass, he could see people sitting at red vinyl booths, talking and laughing over simple meals. It looked like something from a movie about normal life, the kind of life he'd never really lived. Alexander hesitated at the door. His $1,000 suit would make him stand out like a peacock in a flock of pigeons. But something about the scene inside called to him. Maybe it was the genuine laughter he could hear, or the way the people seemed so comfortable with each other. Whatever it was, he needed to experience it. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and a few heads turned his way. But the looks weren't the careful, calculated glances he was used to receiving at business dinners. These were just curious glances before people returned to their conversations and meals. The diner was exactly what he'd imagined normal places were like. Worn but clean vinyl seats, a jukebox in the corner playing old songs, and the smell of coffee and home cooking in the air. A handwritten menu board listed items with prices that seemed impossibly low compared to his usual dining experiences. Alexander slid into an empty booth near the window, feeling like an actor who'd wandered onto the wrong movie set. Around him, real conversations flowed naturally. A group of construction workers discussed their weekend plans. An elderly man read a newspaper while sipping coffee. Two women shared a slice of pie and talked about their children. This was what he'd been missing. Not just the food or the atmosphere, but the sense of belonging to something larger than himself. These people had found ways to connect that had nothing to do with business cards or net worth. They were rich in ways his accountants could never measure. For the first time in years, Alexander felt hopeful. Maybe it wasn't too late to find what he'd lost. Maybe success didn't have to mean isolation. Maybe, at 52, he could still learn how to be human again. As he sat there, watching normal people live normal lives, Alexander made a silent promise to himself. Tomorrow might mark 30 years of building his empire, but perhaps it could also mark the beginning of building something even more valuable, a real life worth living. Alexander sat in the worn vinyl booth, feeling like he'd stepped into a different world. The diner buzzed with quiet energy that was completely foreign to his usual environment. Instead of the careful whispers and calculated conversations of boardrooms, he heard genuine laughter and easy chatter. A group of workers, in paint-splattered clothes, shared jokes over burgers. An older couple read different sections of the same newspaper, occasionally sharing interesting bits with each other. The contrast hit him like a physical weight. These people seemed so comfortable, so natural with each other. When was the last time he'd felt that kind of ease around another human being? He couldn't remember. The plastic menu in his hands felt strange after years of leather-bound wine lists and printed menus on heavy paper. Everything here was simple, honest. No fancy descriptions or inflated prices. Just real food with real names. Meatloaf and mashed potatoes. Apple pie. Coffee that cost less than his usual tip. A young woman approached his table, and Alexander looked up from the menu. She had kind brown eyes and dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. There were paint stains on her fingers, bright blues and yellows that looked like they'd been there for days. Her name tag said Maya in cheerful, red letters, slightly crooked as if she'd pinned it on in a hurry. "First time here?" she asked, and her smile was completely genuine. Not the careful practiced smiles Alexander was used to from people who knew exactly how much money he had. This was real curiosity, like she actually cared about his answer. "Yes," Alexander said, suddenly aware of how his expensive suit must look in this humble place. "I was walking and saw the lights." Maya nodded like this made perfect sense. "That's how most people find us. We're tucked away from all the fancy places downtown." She gestured around the cozy diner with obvious affection. "But once people try Tony's cooking, they keep coming back. Are you hungry or just looking for a warm place to sit?" The question surprised him. No one ever asked what he actually needed. People usually just assumed or tried to guess what would impress him. "I think I'm hungry," he admitted. I haven't eaten since this morning. Maya's expression shifted to genuine concern. Oh, that's terrible. You must be starving. She leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice like she was sharing a secret. Let me tell you what's really good tonight. The meatloaf is incredible. Tony makes it exactly like his grandmother taught him. She came here from Italy 60 years ago, and the recipe hasn't changed since. The mashed potatoes are real, made from actual potatoes, not powder, and the green beans are fresh, not from a can. Alexander found himself smiling for the first time all day. You make it sound like a family dinner. That's exactly what it is, Maya said with enthusiasm. Tony treats every customer like family. He takes it personally if someone leaves here, hungry or unhappy. Then I'll have the meatloaf, Alexander decided. Perfect choice. Coffee to start? Maya was already reaching for the pot she carried, moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this thousands of times. Please. Alexander watched as she poured the dark liquid into a simple white mug. No fine china or silver service, just coffee in a regular cup. But it smelled rich and strong, more appealing than the fancy drinks his assistant usually ordered for him. As Maya walked away to place his order, Alexander found himself watching her move through the diner. She stopped at every table, checking on customers with the same genuine care she'd shown him. She laughed with the workers, asked the older man about his grandson's baseball game, and brought the couple sharing dessert fresh napkins without being asked. This was what real service looked like, Alexander realized. Not the careful attention he received because of his wealth and status, but simple human kindness extended to everyone equally. Maya treated the tired-looking woman counting quarters for her coffee with the same respect she'd shown him in his $1,000 suit. When she returned with his meal, the plate was simple white ceramic, chipped slightly at the edge. But the food looked incredible. The meatloaf was thick and hearty. The mashed potatoes had real lumps that proved they were made by hand, and everything steamed with the kind of heat that came from a kitchen where someone actually cared. This looks amazing, Alexander said, and he meant it completely. Maya's face lit up with pride. Tony will be so happy to hear that. He puts his whole heart into every single plate. She paused, studying Alexander's face with gentle concern. You look like you've had a really long day. Alexander took a bite of the meatloaf and closed his eyes. It tasted like warmth and comfort, like childhood memories he'd never actually had. Everything about it was unpretentious and perfect. You could say that, he said softly. Actually, it's been a long 30 years. 30 years of what? Maya asked, and to Alexander's surprise, she slid into the seat across from him. In his usual world, such casualness would have been unthinkable. Staff maintained careful distance. Here it felt completely natural. Alexander hesitated. How could he explain his life to someone who probably earned in a year what he made in a few hours? Building something, he said finally. But lately, I'm wondering if I built the right thing. Maya nodded like she understood completely. I know that feeling. I've been working on something for 3 years now, and some days I wonder if I'm just kidding myself. What are you working on? Alexander asked, surprised by how much he wanted to know about this stranger's life. Maya's entire face changed, lighting up with passion. I teach art to kids after school. Kids who don't have much, you know. Their parents work multiple jobs, or they're in foster care, or they just need somewhere safe to be after school ends. She gestured with her hands as she talked, and the paint stains on her fingers suddenly made perfect sense. You should see what they create when someone believes in them. Absolutely amazing stuff. Alexander leaned forward, genuinely interested. That sounds incredible. How did you start? Kind of by accident. Maya laughed, her eyes sparkling. I was working here to pay for art school, and this little boy started coming in every afternoon. His mom worked late shifts, and he had nowhere else to go. He was maybe 7 years old, sitting by himself trying to do homework at one of these tables. She paused to refill Alexander's coffee, her movements automatic but thoughtful. I felt so bad for him just sitting there alone. So I started giving him crayons and paper to draw with while he waited for his mom. Made the time pass faster, you know? And other kids started coming? Alexander guessed. Exactly. Pretty soon I had 8 or 9 kids showing up every day after school. They'd do homework, then draw pictures. Before I knew it, I was teaching them basic art techniques, helping them express themselves. Maya's smile grew wider. The owner here, Rosie, she's got the biggest heart in the world. She said I could use the back corner as long as I needed to. How many kids do you work with now? Alexander asked. 23 regulars with new ones showing up all the time. We've completely outgrown this little corner, but I can't afford real space yet. Maya's enthusiasm never dimmed, even as she described what sounded like an impossible situation. I work here nights and weekends, teach the kids after school, and spend every free moment trying to figure out funding and find a permanent space. Alexander thought about his own schedule, endless meetings about profit margins and market to share. The kids must mean everything to you. They do, but honestly, I think I need them more than they need me, Maya said quietly. When you watch a kid who's been told they're not smart or talented create something beautiful, it changes you. It reminds you what really matters in life. Alexander stared at this remarkable young woman, who had so little but seemed to have everything that mattered. When was the last time his work had felt meaningful like that? Alexander found himself returning to the diner 3 nights later. He told himself it was just convenient, that he happened to be in the neighborhood again. But the truth was simpler and more complicated. He couldn't stop thinking about his conversation with Maya. Her passion for helping those kids had stayed with him through 2 days of board meetings and conference calls that suddenly felt meaningless. The bell chimed as he entered, and Maya looked up from wiping down a table. Her face broke into a genuine smile of recognition. You came back. How was the meatloaf withdrawal? Alexander laughed, surprised by how easy it felt. Terrible. I tried to explain to my chef what I wanted, but it just wasn't the same. You have a chef? Maya asked, then immediately looked embarrassed. Sorry, that's none of my business. It's fine, Alexander said, sliding into the same booth as before. And yes, I do. But he's never made anything that tasted like home the way Tony's food does. Maya poured his coffee without asking, already learning his preferences. That's because Tony cooks with love. My grandmother always said you can taste the difference when someone puts their heart into the food. As the weeks passed, these evening visits became Alexander's favorite part of each day. The diner stayed open until midnight, and after the dinner rush died down, Maya would sit with him during her breaks. Their conversations meandered from childhood memories to dreams for the future, from books they'd read to places they wanted to travel. Alexander learned that Maya had grown up in foster care, moving between families who saw her as a monthly check rather than a person. Art had been her escape, her way of making sense of a world that often felt chaotic and unkind. She'd put herself through community college, working 3 jobs, determined to become the adult she'd needed as a child. That's why the art program matters so much, she explained one evening, absently sketching on a napkin as they talked. These kids, they're dealing with stuff no child should have to handle. But when they paint or draw, they can express things they don't have words for yet. Alexander watched her hands move across the napkin, creating a perfect little drawing of the coffee cup in front of her. You're incredibly talented. Have you ever thought about showing your work professionally? Maya shrugged. Maybe someday. Right now, all my energy goes into the kids and keeping myself fed and housed. She gestured around the diner. This place keeps me afloat, but barely. It was during their 4th week of evening conversations that Maya's old car finally gave up completely. Alexander arrived at the diner to find her stressed and exhausted, having taken 3 buses to get to work. The mechanic says it needs a new transmission, she explained, rubbing her temples. That's more than I make in 2 months here. I guess I'll be riding buses for a while. Alexander's first instinct was to write a check, to solve her problem, the way he solved everything else, with money. But something held him back. Maybe it was the pride in Maya's voice when she talked about earning her way through school, or the way she never asked anyone for help despite clearly needing it. Could give you a ride, he offered instead. I mean, if you don't mind. Maya looked surprised. You don't have to do that. I'm sure you have more important things to do than drive a waitress around. Actually, Alexander said, realizing it was completely true, I can't think of anything more important. And so began their daily drives. Alexander would pick Maya up from her day job teaching the kids, drive her to the diner, then return at closing time to take her home. These car rides became the highlight of his day. Away from the diner's bustle, their conversations grew deeper and more personal. Maya told him about the kids she worked with, like 8-year-old Luis, who drew incredible detailed pictures of dragons but couldn't read yet because he'd missed so much school moving between homes. Or 10-year-old Sophia, whose drawings were all in shades of gray until she started coming to art class and slowly began adding color back into her world. Yesterday, Sophia painted a rainbow, Maya said one evening as Alexander drove her home. It was the first time I'd seen her use bright colors. She said it was because she felt happy for the first time in months. Alexander found himself looking forward to these stories more than his quarterly earnings reports. Maya's work was changing lives in ways his business never could, despite all its success and reach. But Maya's influence was changing Alexander too, in ways he was only beginning to understand. In board meetings, he started asking different questions. Instead of just focusing on profit margins, he wanted to know how their decisions affected employees' families. When his company considered outsourcing customer service to cut costs, Alexander found himself thinking about the workers who would lose their jobs. His business partners noticed the change immediately. During a particularly tense meeting about expanding into overseas markets, Alexander questioned whether they were taking advantage of workers in countries with fewer labor protections. Since when do you care about social responsibility? His longtime business partner Richard asked after the meeting. We're here to make money, not save the world. Maybe we can do both, Alexander replied, surprising himself with his own words. Word of Alexander's softening spread through corporate circles. At a charity gala, the kind of event he used to attend purely for networking, other business leaders questioned his recent decisions to increase employee benefits and environmental protections. You're getting soft, Alexander, commented Patricia Wells, CEO of a major manufacturing company. These bleeding heart policies will hurt your bottom line. Alexander looked around the ballroom filled with people who measured success only in dollars and stock prices. A year ago, he would have agreed with Patricia. Now, her words made him feel sick. Meanwhile, Maya struggled with her own challenges. The art program had grown to 35 kids, far more than the diner's back corner could accommodate. Parents were starting to ask when she'd have a real space, proper supplies, maybe even assistant teachers. The need was clearly there, but Maya's finances were stretched impossibly thin. One particularly difficult evening, she arrived at the diner visibly upset. Alexander immediately noticed her red-rimmed eyes and the way she moved with defeated shoulders. What's wrong? He asked gently. Maya sat down heavily across from him. I got an eviction notice today. My landlord's selling the building and the new owners want to double the rent. I have 30 days to find somewhere else to live. Alexander felt his heart break for her. Maya worked harder than anyone he knew, gave more of herself than seemed humanly possible, and still couldn't catch a break. The unfairness of it made him angry at a world that rewarded his empty corporate maneuvering while punishing Maya's genuine contribution to society. There has to be something we can do, he said. Maya gave him a tired smile. We? This isn't your problem, Alexander. You've already done more than enough, driving me around and listening to me complain about my life. But Alexander was beginning to realize that Maya's problems were becoming his problems, not because he had to solve them, but because he genuinely cared about her happiness in a way he'd never cared about another person's well-being. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. Alexander couldn't sleep that night. He kept thinking about Maya's eviction notice, about how someone who gave so much to the world could struggle just to keep a roof over her head. He'd built a fortune that could solve her problems 100 times over, but every time he considered offering money, he remembered the pride in her voice when she talked about earning her way through life. The next morning brought another shock. Alexander was reviewing quarterly reports when his assistant knocked on his office door. "There's a reporter here from Business Today magazine. Says it's urgent." The reporter, a sharp-eyed woman named Jennifer Chen, slid a tablet across Alexander's. On the screen was a photo of him and Maya leaving the diner together, taken 3 nights ago. The headline read, "Billionaire CEO's Secret Life. Alexander Hartwell spotted with mysterious woman." "Care to comment on your relationship with this young lady?" Jennifer asked, her pen poised over her notepad. Alexander's blood ran cold. In his world, privacy was a luxury he'd always been able to afford, but apparently not anymore. "No comment," he said firmly. Within hours, the photo was everywhere. Social media exploded with speculation about Maya's identity. The company's stock price fluctuated as investors wondered if their CEO was distracted by romance. Alexander's phone rang constantly with calls from board members, business partners, and reporters seeking statements, but it was Maya's reaction that worried him most. When he arrived at the diner that evening, she was nowhere to be found. Tony, the cook, emerged from the kitchen with a grim expression. "She saw the news," Tony said simply. "Went home sick about an hour ago. Poor kid looked like she'd seen a ghost." Alexander drove to Maya's apartment building, his heart pounding. He found her sitting on the front steps, still wearing her diner uniform, staring at her phone with tears in her eyes. "Maya," he said softly, sitting down beside her. She looked up at him with a mixture of hurt and confusion. "You're Alexander Hartwell, the Alexander Hartwell, owner of Hartwell Technologies." Her voice was barely a whisper. Alexander nodded, feeling sick. "I should have told you. Should have told me." Maya's voice rose. "I've been pouring my heart out to you for weeks about my struggles, about not having enough money for art supplies, about losing my apartment. And you're worth, what did the article say, $12 billion? Maya, please let me explain." "Explain what? That you've been pretending to be someone else? That you've been treating me like some kind of charity case? Some interesting, poor person to study for your entertainment?" The accusation hit Alexander like a physical blow. "That's not what this was. That's not what you are to me." Maya stood up, wrapping her arms around herself. "Then what am I? Because right now I feel like the biggest fool in the world. I actually thought—" She shook her head. "It doesn't matter what I thought." "It does matter," Alexander said desperately. "Maya, these past few weeks have been the most real, the most meaningful weeks of my entire life. You've shown me what actually matters, what I've been missing all these years." "Missing?" Maya's laugh was bitter. "You haven't been missing anything. You have everything anyone could ever want. Meanwhile, I'm about to be homeless, and I've been crying to you about it like you could possibly understand." Alexander wanted to tell her that money couldn't buy the connection she had, the purpose that drove her, the joy he saw in her face when she talked about her kids. But the words sounded hollow even in his own mind. "The kids," Maya continued, her voice breaking. "Oh God, what are they going to think when they see this? Their teacher hanging around with some billionaire. They'll think I'm just another adult who's going to leave them behind for something better." "You would never do that," Alexander said with certainty. "Wouldn't I? Because your world is offering me everything mine can't. Security, resources, the ability to actually help these kids instead of just scraping by." Maya wiped her eyes angrily. "That's the worst part. Part of me is tempted, and I hate myself for it." Before Alexander could respond, Maya's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and her face went pale. "It's my landlord. He's seen the news. He wants to meet tomorrow to discuss my situation." She looked up at Alexander with dawning horror. "He thinks I'm your girlfriend. He thinks I have money now." The implications hit Alexander immediately. Maya's rent would probably skyrocket. Her simple life would become impossibly complicated, all because of her association with him. "Maya, I can help." "No," she said sharply. "Don't you see? That's exactly the problem. You can fix everything with money, but that's not real life. Real life is working 3 jobs and still worrying about rent. Real life is choosing between buying art supplies and buying groceries. You've never lived real life, and I don't think you ever could." She started walking toward her building, then stopped and turned back. "I need some time to think. Please don't come to the diner for a while." Alexander watched her disappear into the building, feeling more alone than he had even before meeting her. He sat in his car for a long time, staring up at the dim light in what he assumed was her window. The next few days were a nightmare. The media attention intensified, with photographers camping outside both the diner and Maya's apartment building. Alexander's business partners scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss damage control. His ex-fiancée Victoria called, having seen the news from Paris where she was attending Fashion Week. "Really, Alexander?" Victoria's voice was amused rather than hurt. "A waitress? I thought you had better taste." Victoria had been Alexander's fiancée 5 years ago, back when he'd still thought he wanted a conventional marriage to someone from his social circle. She was beautiful, educated, and understood the demands of his lifestyle because she had no real interests of her own, beyond spending money and attending social events. "I'm flying back tomorrow," Victoria continued. "We need to talk about getting you out of this mess. Mother always said you'd come to your senses eventually." Alexander ended the call without responding, but Victoria's words stayed with him. His old life was calling him back, offering the safety of predictability and social approval. No photographers, camping outside inappropriate restaurants. No complicated emotions or messy realities. Meanwhile, Maya's situation grew worse. The media attention made it impossible for her to work at the diner without causing chaos. Reporters ambushed her on the street, asking about her relationship with Alexander and whether his money had influenced her feelings for him. The questions made her sick. Worst of all, some of the parents of her art students began pulling their children out of the program. They worried about the attention, about their kids being photographed, about whether Maya's judgment could be trusted if she was involved with someone so far outside their world. Maya watched her life's work crumble because of a connection that had felt like the most genuine thing she'd ever experienced. She spent hours questioning everything. Had Alexander's interest been real, or was she just an amusing diversion from his real life? Had she been naive to think someone like him could truly understand someone like her? The irony wasn't lost on her. Alexander's wealth could solve all her practical problems, but his world was destroying everything that actually mattered to her. She was losing her kids, her purpose, her sense of self, all because she dared to believe in a connection that crossed impossible boundaries. As Alexander sat in his empty penthouse, staring out at the city lights that had once symbolized his success, he realized that Maya had been right about one thing. He'd never lived real life. But now, having glimpsed what real connection felt like, he didn't know how to go back to the hollow existence he'd built for himself. Alexander spent the worst week of his life trapped in his ivory tower. Every business meeting felt meaningless. Every quarterly report seemed like numbers on paper that had nothing to do with real human lives. He kept thinking about Maya, wondering if she was okay, if she'd found a new place to live, if her art program had survived the media storm he'd brought into her world. His assistant brought him newspaper clippings and online articles, thinking he'd want to monitor the coverage. Instead, they made him sick. Photos of Maya hiding her face from cameras, headlines speculating about their relationship, opinion pieces debating whether billionaires dating ordinary people was genuine or just a publicity stunt. One article particularly haunted him. It was an interview with Dr. Patricia Rodriguez, a child psychologist who worked with foster children. She explained how media attention could traumatize vulnerable kids who were already struggling with abandonment issues. When their safe spaces become circus acts, she said, these children lose trust in the adults who are supposed to protect them. Alexander realized he'd done exactly what Maya feared most. He'd become another adult who disrupted the kids' lives even if he'd never intended to. Victoria arrived from Paris with a solution that felt like poison. She breezed into his office wearing a designer dress that cost more than Maya made in 6 months, carrying plans for damage control that made Alexander's stomach turn. "Darling, this is all easily fixed," Victoria said, spreading newspaper clippings across his conference table like battle plans. "We announce our engagement. I've already had my publicist draft the statement. A romantic reunion story always beats a charity case romance. The media will forget about your little waitress within a week. Her name is Maya, Alexander said quietly. Whatever. The point is, you return to your real life, marry someone appropriate, and this whole embarrassing episode disappears. Victoria smiled confidently. Mother's already planning the engagement party. September at the country club. Alexander stared at Victoria and saw his old life clearly for the first time. Safe, predictable, empty. A life where relationships were transactions and love was a luxury he'd convinced himself he didn't need. No, he said simply. Victoria blinked in surprise. No to the country club? We could do the plaza instead. No to all of it, Alexander stood up. I'm not marrying you, Victoria. I never should have proposed before, and I'm not making that mistake again. Mistake? Victoria's voice rose. Alexander, you're being ridiculous. That girl isn't right for you. She's from a completely different world. You're right, Alexander said. She is from a different world. A world where people care about each other more than stock prices. Where someone would rather struggle than compromise their values. Where love isn't a business arrangement. Victoria's face hardened. Fine. Throw away everything you've built for some fantasy. But don't come crying to me when reality hits. After Victoria left, Alexander sat alone in his office, staring out at the city below. For 30 years, he'd climbed higher and higher, believing that success meant rising above everyone else. But Maya had shown him something different, that real success meant lifting others up alongside you. That's when he made the most important decision of his life. The next morning, Alexander called an emergency board meeting. His business partners filed into the conference room expecting to discuss damage control strategies. Instead, Alexander announced his resignation as CEO. You're stepping down? Richard looked stunned. Over a woman? No, Alexander said calmly. I'm stepping down because I've finally figured out what I want to do with my life. He explained his plan. He would remain as chairman but step back from daily operations. His successor was already trained and ready. Most importantly, he was restructuring his personal wealth to create a foundation focused on community programs like Maya's art classes. You're talking about giving away millions, another board member protested. I'm talking about investing in things that actually matter, Alexander replied. The hardest part was figuring out how to approach Maya without making things worse. He couldn't just show up at her apartment again. The media was still camped outside. He couldn't call the diner because she'd asked for space, so he did something he'd never done before. He asked for help. Tony, the diner's cook, agreed to meet Alexander at a coffee shop across town. The older man listened patiently as Alexander explained his plan. The question is, Tony said when Alexander finished, are you doing this for her? Or are you doing this to make yourself feel better? Alexander had been asking himself the same thing. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe both, but Tony, I can't go back to the way things were. She changed something in me that I can't undo. Tony studied his face for a long moment. Maya's been hurt bad, son. Not just by you, but by life. People in her position learn not to trust easy fixes or promises from people with power. Then what do I do? You prove it, Tony said simply. Not with money or grand gestures. You prove you understand what matters to her, and you show her you're willing to live it, not just fund it. Alexander spent the next month doing exactly that. He volunteered at a community center in Maya's neighborhood, working with kids who reminded him of her students. He learned to paint walls, organize supply closets, and listen to teenagers who needed someone to care about their problems. He worked quietly, without publicity or fanfare. When reporters occasionally recognized him, he politely declined interviews and kept working. Slowly, the media attention faded as newer stories took its place. Maya heard about his volunteer work through the community grapevine. At first, she assumed it was another rich person's guilt project that would end when he got bored. But weeks passed and Alexander kept showing up. Rain or shine, weekends and evenings, he was there. One of Maya's former students, a 10-year-old named Carlos, started attending the community center where Alexander volunteered. Carlos came home one day with stories about the nice man who'd helped him with homework and listened to him talk about missing his art classes. He said he knows Miss Maya, Carlos told his mother. He said she's the best teacher in the world, and he hopes she gets to teach again soon. Word got back to Maya, and she found herself curious despite her hurt. The Alexander she'd known had been kind and genuine, but was that the real him or just an act? The only way to find out was to see for herself. Maya arrived at the community center on a Thursday evening, watching through the window as Alexander sat on the floor with a group of kids, helping them with a science project. His expensive clothes were gone, replaced by jeans and a t-shirt that had seen better days. Paint streaked his hands, different colors than the ones that had once marked hers. He looked up and saw her through the window. Their eyes met, and Maya saw something she hadn't expected, the same man she'd fallen for at the diner, but somehow more real, more grounded. After the kids left, Maya finally approached him. "Carlos says you're a good helper," she said softly. Alexander smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since everything fell apart. "Carlos is a good teacher. He's been showing me how to see the world differently. Like someone else." "I used to know," Maya said. They talked until the janitor politely asked them to leave so he could lock up. They walked slowly through the neighborhood, past the diner where they'd first met, past Maya's old apartment building where she no longer lived. "I'm sorry," Alexander said as they stopped at the bus stop where Maya would catch her ride home. "I'm sorry I wasn't honest from the beginning. I'm sorry my world hurt you and the kids. I'm sorry I was too afraid to be real with you." Maya looked at this man who'd given up his old life to build something new, something meaningful. "I'm sorry, too," she said. "I was so hurt that I couldn't see you were trying to change. So where do we go from here?" Alexander asked. Maya smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it reached her eyes. "How about we start over? I'm Maya Rodriguez. I teach art to kids who need someone to believe in them." Alexander held out his hand. "I'm Alexander Hartwell. I'm still figuring out what I want to be when I grow up, but I think it involves helping people like you change the world." As they shook hands like strangers meeting for the first time, both of them knew they were really beginning something entirely new. Not a fairy tale, but something better. A real partnership built on shared values and genuine love.